Hello, welcome to this COVID session on measuring the impact of COVID on the economy. My name is Sumit Dey-Chowdhury. I am based in the Office for National Statistics in the UK, and it's my real pleasure to be asked to have chaired this session. We have three talks that we are going to be listening to today. The first one is from Takeshi Sakuramoto, and he's presenting some work, some collaborative work that gives a bit of the Japanese experience of the impact of COVID on the economy there. So specifically looking at the impact on statistics surveys and estimation procedures in the Japan statistical system. We're then going to hear from Melanie, who's based in the Office for National Statistics, and she's going to be giving, sharing some insights on developing a quality indicator for research and development in the UK. And then finally, I will be giving a talk on just how the impact of the coronavirus has been felt in estimates of GDP in the United Kingdom. So it's my real pleasure to hand over to Takeshi here, who's going to talk us through his presentation, and there'll be time for a Q&A at the end of that. So if you do want to raise any questions, please just use the Q&A function, and I will take those all at the end, if that's okay. Thank you very much. Takeshi, over to yourself.
Okay, thank you very much for chair. And I'm Takeshi Sakuramoto. Can I share my slide? Okay. We appreciate this opportunity. Thank you very much. And we are going to show 2 points in this presentation. At first, we introduce the impact of the COVID-19 to Japanese economy with official statistics and big data. Second, we will explain the relation between COVID-19 and statistical system. Sorry. And number of the infected people are here. Now we are in the final stage of second wave. Megalopolises such as Tokyo, Osaka are not safe yet. And our environment has rapidly changed, but only in the summer, Japanese people and the government are becoming more confident about infectious disease control. Please look at the figure 2, figures from 2 to 6, series of the big data in Japan. Figure 2 shows the index of the estimated mobility population. The estimated population, mainly during the hour of 0 to 6 and 12 to 18, is declining. The mobility population has decreased significantly, mainly in large cities and megalopolises such as Tokyo and Osaka. In the 4th week of August, the number of the mobility population in Japan has decreased by only 11%. So here, thus Japan prevents the spread of the infection without changing the frequency of going out during summer. About the next slide, based on the credit payment data, e-commerce continued to increase, fuel and car retail reduced. Let's go to the figure 4, retail data of convenience store. Figure 4 shows a rapid increase in household medicine. About figure 5, foreign travelers could not go to Japan this year. Number of hotel guests reduced, and travel alone returned a little now. So 81%. And about figure 6, most of all music, sports, art, events and concerts are canceled. Event numbers has not returned now. Here, Japanese economists predict that the economic impact of COVID-19 to GDP will be around -6% to -8% annually. This table is a historical series of GNP instead of GDP because we don't have the very old data, so we don't have the GDP series. And this is close to the situation of huge earthquake in Tokyo, or World Depression, and World War II period. If GDP growth rate continue to annually, GDP will reduce about -28% here. Japanese government to deal with estimation with special treatment. Household final consumption was expected to decrease in March. In Japan, the economic shock is great even though the lockdown is severe. About survey system, Ministry of Internal Affairs and Communication has asked each ministry's statistics to consider changing the survey conducting method. The Ministry of Internal Affairs flexibly deal with authorizing procedure as to the changes in survey methods. Figure 7 is statistical system in Japan. Each ministries conduct survey. Japanese system is decentralized system, and each ministries cooperate each other, central government and about the central government and local government. And figure 8 shows survey procedure. There are 9 types surveys in Japan. Central government and local government area, and enumerator and survey subject. The enumerator surveys gradually switch to mail and online method now. There are 4 cases in the concrete measures in conducting surveys. Enumerator survey are shifting to mail and online surveys at first. About second cases, the deadline of survey response was extended. About third and fourth points, some surveys were deferred or canceled. This slide is about population census in Japan. Statistics Bureau is conducting population census now. Bureau recommends internet response was. The response deadline was extended. About the benchmark year of the official statistics, 2020 is not a normal year. We cannot ignore the shock of the COVID-19, but government of Japan decided not to change the economic census and base year of national accounts and supply and use table. Government made the web application of big data and official statistics. EStat is the largest database of the official statistics in Japan. And the government developed the free official application of JStatMap, research, and V-research for COVID-19 recently. The data source from figure 2 to 6 are V-Lisas. First case is AD distribution. AD means the here automated external, very long name. And for the hard shock, the range of the 150 meters are effective. In Japan, JSTAT map is the basis of disaster policies. Central and local governments utilize this application JSTAT map and open data for the shelters for floods and the location of evacuation buildings for tsunamis. Japan is a disaster country. We have many kinds of disaster. We have the rich experience of the disasters, especially great earthquakes and tsunamis. But statistical surveys have not changed at all, and statistics production sites have become accustomed to disasters. This slide is the example of the shelter buildings for tsunami in Fukushima Bayside. After Great Earthquake 2011, we can analyze the tsunami by GIS application of JSTAT map for policies freely. This is free and official service. And this slide is about drone airspace. In Japan, drone users must be aware of densely populated district based on the population census. So most of all drone users utilize the JSTAT map. Drone airspace in Japan depends on the sea area, sea airspace, densely populated area of population census. Government of Japan quickly developed the big data application called LISAS and V-Lisas. And V-Lisas is for the COVID-19 this year. We try to combine the official statistics and big data. And finally, mobility population of most regions has already returned to the level of the previous period, and number of infection cases of the second wave is slowing down since summer. The e-commerce market has been rapidly expanding, while the expenditures of restaurants and travel has been continued to be decreased. The mobility restrictions and number of the infections relatively remain low, and overall economic shock is as great as the one of the greater shock of the earlier 20th century. Very huge earthquakes and the Great Depression and World War II. Complementary analysis using the big data increasingly becoming popular due to the detailed geographical and time coverage and the conventional timely statistics. Okay, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much for that talk, a really interesting one. I will open it up for Q&A. So if there is anyone that would like to raise a question, if you could just put that in the the tool that's available at the bottom of your screens. And we'll kind of pick those. I have a couple myself, but I don't want to abuse my position as a chair there. So. Can't see any at the moment, but while we wait for those to filter in, the one I would like to ask you about is around the benchmark here. So you kind of spoke about that, what you would have been the case in the absence of COVID would have been that you carried out your economic census next year with regards to 2020 as the benchmark year, but you're not able to do that because you obviously that has like a distorting effect. But what are you doing in response as a result? Because I guess that the trade-off there is that I don't know if it's 2015 weights then you're having to rely on. Is there some kind of extrapolation, or is there other types of indicators to help you with the weight? Or is it that you're just going to keep the 2015 or the previous ones in place?
Also economic census, sorry. Here. About the economic census, there in the Office of Statistical Commission discuss about benchmark year and economic census, and some members discuss about postpone to the next year or 2020's why the reason for like 2020's survey base year, and many members discuss about this year. But recently, COVID-19 shock is a very long period, and we have many kinds of disaster in Japan, and we have many shocks in Japan, and so we have rich experience for disaster. So COVID-19 and tsunami, very huge earthquake, and many kinds of the disaster, they are normal life in Japan, normal life. So we decided 2020 is one choice. That is not good choice, but disaster is no normal life in Japan. So we decided, and about the base year, I think that there are many choices in Japan, and next year and the next year, in the future, Japan Stable and National Accountants discuss about the base year. But now, most of all people agree to 2020 is base year now. This is not the final distribution, final choice, but in the future we have to think about that. But now this is a temporary choice.
Thank you very much for that. I can't see any other Q&A at this stage. I had one more, if that's okay, and it was almost what you touched upon there, and it was the Japanese experience of kind of disasters. So I suppose from a UK perspective, this is very unique. We have no real, not in terms of our recent experience, at least in the last 50, 60 years, there's nothing that we have that can compare to this one. So I was just wondering, in terms of the experiences that you've had, and you kind of spoke about some of the great earthquakes, but also the tools that you're showing, like the publicly available tools. And I'm just wondering, is that something that's been there in place for a number of years now, and you've just updated how you communicate that with the public, or is that something that was newly developed because of COVID?
very difficult to answer quickly. But I think that we don't have the magic. So only weak national accounts and many statisticians have to record, but make effort, but only analyze many times. And in Japan, there are many disasters in Japan, so we can revise time series data many times for disasters. And so there are many chances, and we have many kinds of choices to solve the problem. About the 10 years to estimate, generally speaking.
Thank you very much. I can see we've got one question in the Q&A. So Emily, could you please unmute Joseph Haynes so you can ask his question, please?
Okay, sorry, pardon? Sorry.
So there'll be one question coming through.
Just a short question about, you said that schools in Japan were closed from March until July. How was that accounted for in the GDP statistics? Was education output changed like the UK did, or was it left as it ordinarily would be without COVID?
Sorry, GDP statistics. Now, we are Statistical Commission. We are discuss about the shock of the education, but now we don't estimate the series, because Japanese Q&A is mainly expenditure side, so that is not production side. So we don't know the real situation. Sorry.
Just for information, I mean, I'll talk a little bit about the UK experience, shamelessly plugging my own slides later on, but it might be one we can kind of pick up there as well, if that's helpful, just in terms of the UK experience. I can't see any further questions right now. So what I'm going to do is just thank Takeshi very much for his presentation, really interesting one. There will be time for further questions towards the end of the session. So if there are any other questions that people come up, if you do raise them through the Q&A bar, I'm kind of happy to field those at the very end when I'll invite all the panelists back online. So next on our agenda is Melanie Lewis, who is based in the Office for National Statistics, and she's going to tell us about her work on measuring R&D. Over to you, Melanie.
Okay, hi everyone. So I'm going to be talking about our work to develop a quarterly data for research and developments in the UK, and particularly how we've done that as a response to COVID-19. So the content of what I'm going to be speaking about, I'll first talk about how we capture R&D, what it is, and why we consider it as capital formation. And I'll talk through the current data sources that we use and the methods that we use in our statistics. And secondly, why COVID-19 was important and how that's had an impact on our work. And then I will talk specifically about the project that we've been doing to find a quarterly source, looking at the potential data sources that we've used, how I've assessed those against the dimensions of quality, and what the outcome of that was, and the proposed method. So first of all, kind of capturing R&D. There is an official definition in what's known as the Frascati Manual, and this is that R&D comprise creative and systematic work undertaken in order to increase the stock of knowledge, including knowledge of humankind, culture, and society, and to devise new applications of available knowledge. And there are 5 key criteria that any activity must satisfy to be considered as research and development. That is, that it must be novel, it must be creative, it must be uncertain in some way, it must be systematic, and it must be transferable and or reproducible. It's worth saying at this point as well that R&D is a major government priority at the moment in the UK. So just this year in July, the government has published its R&D roadmap, which includes some really ambitious targets. One of those is that the government would like to increase spending on R&D to £22 billion per year, public spending, by the year 2025. And this compares with about £2.5 billion in 2018. So that's a massive jump. And they would like to take that from what was about 1.7% of GDP being spent in the total economy, R&D in 2018, to 2.4% of GDP by 2027. So really looking to increase what we invest as R&D in the UK. And so why am I interested as somebody who kind of works in the capital stocks team? Why were I interested in R&D as capital formation? Well, since the System of National Accounts in 2008 and the European System of Accounts in 2010, R&D has been considered as capital formation rather than intermediate consumption. So we are recognising that anybody spending money on R&D is actually making an investment, and what they are investing in is that capital stock of knowledge, the knowledge which is going to benefit their organisation or society as a whole for a substantial period into the future. And therefore, we need to capture R&D as part of our annual and quarterly estimates of gross fixed capital formation. In particular, at ONS, we publish a business investment release, and this provides a quarterly time series for R&D in the economy, as well as its aggregation by industry at the section level. So it's really, really granular what we're currently producing. The current data sources reflect the kind of four main R&D sectors that are described in the Frascati manual. This is business enterprise, government, higher education, and private non-profits. So for business, we use the Business Enterprise Expenditure and Research and Development, or BERD survey. And this is an annual business survey which is sent to businesses that we know perform R&D, and we identify those from a range of other sources, including the annual business survey. We know that R&D is very highly concentrated in the economy. About 75% of business R&D is done by only around 400 businesses. So we really want to ask them a lot of questions. We send a long questionnaire to those sort of 400 businesses and send a smaller questionnaire to a sample then of smaller R&D performers. For government, there are actually two sources. We do have an annual GovERD survey, government expenditure on R&D. But for our GFCS statistics, we actually use ESCoE, which is data from the Treasury, which is a database of government spending, and these both are completed according to the Frascati manual definition. For higher education, we get data in on an annual basis from a number of providers that you can see there. And for private non-profit institutions, we have a biannual survey. And this is a census survey of around 200 non-profit organisations, which we know to form R&D. I kind of asterisk the biennial there because given the disruption kind of caused by COVID-19, our survey team have decided that they are actually going to run the survey in 2021 to cover 2020, which wouldn't otherwise have happened. So for the time being, you could maybe call it annual data instead. So this is the current method, which I'm hoping possibly is simpler than maybe it looks at first glance on the screen. So we have ESCoE data. This is our government data from the Treasury, and this is our only true quarterly source at the moment. We take this as it is, and it becomes the quarterly series for the government sector. For the other data sources, which are annual or biennial, we split these out by industry into the survey responses that are given, or in the case of higher education, we know that's the education industry. And so we have annual series by industry. However, because these are annual sources and they take a bit of a while to come through our system, We don't tend to have the most recent data. In terms of bird, at the moment, the most recent data we have is for 2018 published, whereas for GFCF we have already published Q2 of this year. So we're using a rolling model to forecast for the most recent years. Finally, we want to create a quarterly series from our annual data. And so we use identity collect temporal disaggregation. And this kind of fits a quarterly series to our annual data whilst maintaining that annual additivity. So the 4 quarters in each year will add up to the annual total. If you have another proxy series, a quarterly proxy series, you can feed that into this model as an indicator. However, at the moment, we don't currently have one. So it's just a simple modelling procedure. So if at this point you're thinking, well, there maybe sounds like there could be improvements to this method anyway, and why does COVID-19 matter? You'd be right, this was one of those things that was on the to-do list anyway, but the impact of COVID has really shot this to the top of the priority list because of the explosion of R&D potentially happening as a response to COVID-19, really hammering home the point that perhaps some of our modelling assumptions aren't going to hold true anymore. Just as quick examples, there's so many areas where R&D is potentially happening in the economy. The obvious ones about the search for a vaccine, looking to develop tests, quicker tests, antibody tests, and understand what treatments can be used for COVID-19 patients. We want to kind of understand how the virus spreads and monitor outbreaks. So that's everything from the ONS surveillance survey to testing sewage to see if there is a local outbreak. There's a lot of work at the start of the pandemic to maybe try and produce respiratory aids, such as ventilators or alternatives. And then we have all sorts of other things again, new methods of cleaning, testing different materials as suitability for PPE, apps and software development to help us all navigate this new digital world that we're living in during lockdown. There is the impact of lockdowns on the environment. You know, when humans essentially got out the way, what happened? What was the impact? The behavioural insights work that's fed into government. So, you know, you can have an idealistic lockdown, but we still need to understand how people will actually behave. Impact on mental health, and also new ways of doing business and of providing education services. But we also recognise that despite all of that potential for amazing R&D happening to respond to COVID, there will be an adverse effect as well. In particular, the reprioritisation. So all the researchers that have been put onto COVID work have likely been pulled away from what they were usually doing, and there's likely to have been a change in funding priorities as well as our priorities as a nation change. People also face barriers to doing R&D, particularly during the most severe times of lockdown. Laboratories and libraries would have been closed, so researchers wouldn't be able to access them. And they would have also been unable to travel for the fieldwork they needed to do. And if you were needing to do any research that required interaction with other people, there may have been an inability to do that whilst kind of maintaining the physical distancing requirements that the government has given us. There's also the potential for some medium to long-term impact as well. This is something that we saw in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, and it's maybe not unreasonable to assume that the economic shock that we're experiencing at the moment might have a longer-term impact on R&D. So you can really see how our previous method with kind of forecasting from a couple of years ago and using this quarterly modelling is really not going to capture all of this at the moment. So this leads then to the need to find some kind of quarterly source to better inform us in a more timely manner what is happening to R&D. So here's a selection of the potential data sources that I kind of brainstormed and researched. I won't go through each of these individually for the sake of time, but if you do have any questions about any particular ones of these, then obviously feel free to ask those at the end. But essentially what we were looking for is a quarterly data source that can tell us about the R&D activity that's happening, the R&D expenditure on a much more timely basis than our current kind of survey data can. So in order to assess these data sources, I use the well-known dimensions of quality for statistics. But it was consistent with our code of practice that we adhere to. So the source needed to be relevant. It needs to talk about R&D as defined in the Frascati manual. So it needs to meet that need. We need to understand a measure of how accurate it is and how reliable it is. Obviously, revisions are kind of part and parcel of economic statistics, but we obviously want to have a good understanding of those if we're going to use a new data source. Timeliness is very important with this one. So we want something that's giving us timely data. It needs to be easily accessible. So while we have a particular shock that we want to capture at the moment, there is an ongoing need to have a sustainable quarterly path for R&D. So we do want to have something that's easy to access and that comes with kind of clear metadata and advice so that we can understand how to use it best. And finally, the comparability and coherence. Particularly over time, we have a time series for R&D, and we want to know that any data source that we are using has kind of good temporal comparability. So, what's the outcome of this data?
Seems we may have lost Melanie for a moment there, so if you just bear with us, we'll just try to see if we can get a reconnection there. So just give us a couple of moments. Thank you. So it was always going to happen that there would be one session where there was a kind of technology problems, but Sod's Law says it's on my watch. But hopefully Melanie will be able to reconnect. I know she was having a couple of internet connection challenges earlier. So if we just give her a couple of moments to reconnect, we're still well within time. So hopefully she'll be able to rejoin us in a couple of minutes. But we'll use the opportunity to kind of just say if there are any questions you would like to raise, please do put them in the Q&A bar. She's kind of spoken a little bit so far in terms of the challenges in trying to produce a quarterly indicator, a timely one that kind of captures the dynamics. So there may be some questions you have along that space, or just from international experiences, what you may be doing in other countries. Just give us a couple of moments, and hopefully Melanie will be able to reconnect to the call shortly. It looks like we have Melanie back on the line.
Hi, I'm so sorry.
No, don't be silly. It's quite okay. I kind of explained there were some connection challenges you're having. So
Yeah.
That's quite okay. So the slide you're on were the dimensions of quality. So we can
the dimensions of quality. Okay. Right.
I don't. You may have completed that slide. That was the last one that you had on the screen before it cut out. But
on the screen. Okay, no, that's fine. In which case, so what part of the slide did I get up to?
So you've definitely covered relevance, accuracy, and reliability, and I think my recollection is you're around the timeliness and punctuality, but you may have covered those. But maybe if you just pick up on timeliness and punctuality, just make sure we've got complete coverage then.
All right. Okay. Yeah. No, that's fine. So sorry everybody about that. So yes, that's the dimensions of quality. Obviously, one of the things that's important for this was to have a timely source to kind of coincide with what we needed to publish for the R&D. It needs to be something that is accessible on a sustainable basis. So although we have a particular shock that we are trying to cover at the moment, we do want a sustainable, ongoing quarterly source for R&D. And then finally, the comparability and coherence aspect. We particularly need the data to be comparable over time, or at least we need to have an understanding of that, as this is feeding into a time series that we have. So in terms of the actual outcome of the data investigation itself, so unsurprisingly, but potentially, but unfortunately, there is no comprehensive quarterly source that we have that covers all 4 sectors. However, it was the GDP output measure of the R&D industry that scored the highest according to the dimensions of quality that I was using. We do still have ESCoE, however. This was the government's spending data, and this is our only true quarterly source, so we'll continue to use that. There is as well the potential for to use this as an indicator in the higher education sector. This is because around 2/3 of R&D funding for the higher education sector comes from government in some way, shape or form, primarily through research councils. So there is kind of those 2 sectors are very highly linked. You can see in the table there the kind of the scores are given for GDP output for the R&D industry. It's obviously a highly relevant statistic. It covers just the R&D industry, so it doesn't cover the whole economy, hence it didn't get a perfect score, but it does relate to R&D as we talk about it in the Fiscati manual, and it receives extremely good scores for the other measures as well. It does represent a substantial proportion of R&D output in the economy, which is a big tick. It's not all of it by any means, but it's a large proportion. And using it, we would assume that the output of the R&D industry is reflective of the levels of R&D happening across all the different industries as a product in the economy. In the investigation, there was kind of some evidence that the growth rates of the annual GDP output measures do correlate with the growth rates from our annual survey sources, and I'll show you some of those in a second. However, it does only cover the business and private non-profit sectors, and obviously because it refers only to the R&D industry, we can't provide the usual disaggregations by industry that we normally publish. So the conclusion, therefore, is that although it's not necessarily suitable as a source in its own right for R&D, it has the potential to be an indicator. And that brings me back to this flow chart with the method, and the only thing that's really changed here, if you look to the right-hand side, the green box, talking about the Denton-Collette temporal disaggregation, we now have a potential indicator that we could use to improve that modelling process. So the idea would be that ESCoE would continue to be used for government data. The rest of them would use the GDP output measure as an indicator, apart from the education industry, so that's P, and that would use either ESCoE or potentially a combination of ESCoE and GDP output to be an indicator there. So to show you some of the charts that were kind of produced in looking at the suitability of the sources, it's quite interesting to note really when we plotted the growth rates of the bird data and our GDP output on an annual basis initially, there was actually a negative correlation, although this does improve slightly when we look at the last 10 years, where we would probably hope that the data is of the best quality for both of those sources. However, when we offset the data by 1 year, that correlation improves quite dramatically, and again, particularly in the last 10 years. And this possibly comes down to how these sources are compiled. So the GDP output measure is constructed from the quarterly data that we get in through the monthly business survey, from workforce jobs, from VAT data. It comes in very quickly, and it's describing kind of the outputs, not quite in real time, but very recently after the reference period. Bird, on the other hand, is this annual survey that will go out to businesses in the reference year, so kind of in the year following the reference year, and relates a lot more to the kind of accounting procedures of these companies, and it may be something to do with the way it takes time for that to go through the system, for them to actually capitalise this expenditure as investment in R&D, that we possibly see the results are slightly offset. When we look at the quarterly data then, so this is a comparison, we're using the current R&D series for GFCF statistics and the quarterly GDP output of the R&D industry. A reasonable correlation improves in the last 10 years, but we can really see that the bigger peaks and troughs are really not captured within our kind of current GFCF series. And so there's definite potential there that using this kind of this smoother annual series and only basic modelling, we're really missing those kind of bigger shocks, which is what we really want to capture in a time like this. And kind of the final chart I just want to talk through is a pretty basic comparison, just to demonstrate what happens when we use this dent and collect modelling with and without an indicator. So the green line there is the smooth quarterly path that you get when you don't use an indicator, which I should say probably isn't an exact replica of what we publish as the kind of adjustments and rounding that would be applied in that process. I haven't done here. But you can see then the blue line behind that is the series when you use the quarterly indicator, and it kind of brings back in more of that seasonality, more of the kind of the peaks and troughs, and looks like a much more realistic series. I included there the annual totals as well, which are those yellow dots, and those are the ones on the second axis, and that just really demonstrates how the modelling process kind of fits the trajectory of that annual data, but as I said, it also maintains the annual additivity. You might be able to spot down the bottom there, I've only got up to 2018, so this doesn't account for the most recent years where we would use that forecasting process as well. And this is something that I will come on to just about now. So this is still a work in progress. This project is still ongoing, and although there are, I've kind of made recommendations, that there's still some work to do. The first thing really is it actually a reasonable assumption that the GDP output measure for the R&D sector is reflective of R&D in all sectors, and particularly at a time like COVID, where you will expect an absolute explosion in R&D activity in, say, pharmaceuticals, but less so in manufacturing, where companies had to kind of shut down their operations during lockdown. There's also a need to understand more about the forecasting element of the model, because even if we have a quarterly indicator, if the levels are completely off because we're forecasting them, it's maybe not improving it as much as we would like. The potential then, thirdly, for kind of bespoke indicators for each industry. We have a good knowledge from the supply and use tables of where R&D is being supplied and used in the economy, and there's a potential that we could use this in some way, potentially to do with ratings. And finally, can we yet still find a genuine quarterly source, whether that be administrative data or any surveys that we can adapt? However, as I said earlier, we need to bear in mind that R&D is very concentrated in the economy. Around 400 businesses account for 3/4 of the R&D done in the business sector, and the bird sample accounts for this. So there's the potential that a general business survey wouldn't be useful. And so with that, really, bear in mind it's still a work in progress. Let's finish there, and we'll happily take any questions that anybody might have. And apologies again for cutting out in the middle.
Thank you very much, Melanie. Not at all. Look, I'll open it up for Q&A. If you do have any questions, if you could raise that again in the Q&A function, that would be much appreciated. I've got one or two myself, but I will see if there's any that's coming through first. While I wait to see if there are any more that come through, Melanie, I just wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the dimensions of quality. You kind of spoke about the 5 pillars that are there, and I think one of the themes that have come out in this conference, or at least the talks that I've been to, is almost the balance between those 5. And I guess in normal times, it's pretty difficult to find an optimal one that ticks off all those boxes, but clearly we're not in those times now. And I was just wondering if there's anything in terms of how flexible you and colleagues have been in kind of trying to assess what are the most appropriate ones, or even in your work going forward, because clearly this is going to be really challenging to do. And I just wonder if that's been in your considerations, kind of that flexibility as to what's more important at these times.
Yeah, for sure. For this one, really, one of the most important things is the relevance, because we are talking about a pretty niche topic in R&D, and we really want any kind of indicator to be accurately representing that. Otherwise, it's not going to be telling us the right thing. But I agree, there's always going to be a trade-off. I think, especially when you are looking to get data in a quite timely manner, do you have to compromise on the reliability and understand that maybe later revisions are going to be a bit greater. I think in the GDP output measure, I think I was pleasantly surprised, I think, on how high I was able to score all of these. But of course, there's always going to be priorities, and I think the relevance and the timeliness are possibly the two here that were maybe a priority for me.
Thank you so much. Still looking to see if there's any further questions coming in. I'll give it a couple of moments. We still have time at the end of this session, so if there are ones that come to mind, do feel free to raise it later on. I guess the only other one that I had was kind of around, I suppose, just the challenges of reconciling the supply and demand of R&D. And is that something, and as you said, you kind of showed a couple of charts, I think that kind of gets towards that. Has that something that's been historically been a challenge, I suppose? Because I assume it will be more of a challenge going forward in terms of the data quality, but there may be actually, as you said, because it's more concentrated amongst within the industry itself, that there may be kind of more bespoke types of way of collecting that information and kind of actually helping with some of that coherence by just targeting certain businesses.
Yeah, I think it is quite an interesting one to try and understand how it sort of works in the economy, particularly when you look at the economic ownership of it as well. One of the classic examples that we came across quite early on in the project, thinking specifically about COVID, was the work that the company Dyson in particular were doing around ventilators, and how there was kind of money coming from the government here to help them with that. A lot of the work was being performed in the UK, but the company is actually registered outside of the UK, and so the economic ownership is not there, and it's something that is maybe not considered quite as importantly in the BIRD survey. It's not so much the ownership that is the focus of that survey, it's more that the kind of the funding, the expenditure, who's doing the R&D. But certainly it's something that has been fun at times to untangle, as well how companies choose to kind of classify their R&D arm, as it were, of the company. So some will have an R&D branch in-house, and so they will come under the main industry of the company. Others, and I think this is particularly applicable sort of for pharmaceuticals, the R&D section is so large that they may create an entire new company, and that will form then part of the R&D industry itself, even though what it's feeding into is kind of a different industry. So yes, it's not always as straightforward as you might like, and it's certainly been interesting to understand more about how the kind of supply and demand across the economy works.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for that. I can see that there is one question that's come in. So, Emily, if you'd be okay to unmute Alex Romanko, and he'll be able to ask his question.
Hi, Emily. Thank you so much for the presentation. So, just were wondering whether you used any particular metrics or methodologies while assessing the quality of each of the data sources that you compare, or it's just a 1 to 5 estimate?
Yeah, really it's kind of mainly a 1 to 5 estimate. I'm not particularly aware of kind of a definitive scoring system. This was mainly something that I chose to help me, so that when I'm kind of giving an opinion as to whether a particular data source is suitable, that I could kind of confidently justify that and say, this is why I've given it a score of 1 for relevance, or it's great, and this is why I've given it a score of 5 for timeliness. I hope that answers your question.
Yep, thank you so much.
Brilliant. Well, thank you for that. If there are any further questions, feel free to keep submitting those, and we can kind of pick those up at the end of the session. But for now, Melanie, thanks so much for that. And at this stage, I will bring up my slides, if that's okay. And hopefully you're all able to see those slides. So firstly, thank you very much for coming in. I really appreciate those who are interested in the topic. What I would like to talk about today is coronavirus and the effects on UK GDP. And this is both a theoretical and a kind of practical perspective. It was very clear earlier this year in real time that kind of forecasters and policymakers could almost see in real time that there would be an unprecedented shock to the UK economy. And those who were able to attend the panel session yesterday, there was a lot of a debate around to what extent was this recession unique. And that's kind of one of the things I do want to talk about. That's kind of one of the top main underlying themes for the slides I'm going to go through. It's some of the challenges that we as the ONS faced in kind of compiling estimates and continue to kind of face as we go forward. What was clear that there was a complete consensus as to there would be this large hit, and it would likely be one that we just never experienced on record previously, or at least officially anyway. And that kind of reflects the fact that there was the hit to demand for the goods and services through the imposition of lockdown measures, but also social distancing put in place, but also how this impacted upon businesses' ability to supply those goods and services. And so what we kind of saw at the time was some of the challenges that we expected to face, but also that the need to kind of really focus in on how we communicated those challenges in an open and transparent manner. While there was a consensus that there would be a large shock, if you looked at the range of forecasts that were produced at the time, they kind of conveyed the level of uncertainty. And that was almost inevitable, but I suppose it kind of almost comes down to the known uncertainties and the unknown ones. So what I really want to focus on here is more of the formal ones, some of the statistical production challenges we faced. And it will actually pick on a couple of themes that my co-presenter showed earlier today. So I'll just take you through to the first slide. And this one is very much just for context, to kind of showcase the scale of the challenge. So the chart on the left-hand side here talks about the international experience through the first half of this year, looking across the G7 countries. And what you can see is just the scale here is one that we've just never seen before. Most of the G7 countries, Japan aside, faced double-digit decline in the first half. Now, there are some of the kind of nuances that need to be made when we look at the international comparisons. They will reflect, for example, the extent to which the virus was prevalent, the containment measures that were put in place, but also some of the structural features. For example, the UK is arguably more exposed to some of the kind of social consumption type output that's produced. For example, the service-led economy, where there's very much an interaction between the service provider and the consumer. And you can think of industries like hotels and restaurants, for example, the arts and entertainment. But it kind of just captures the scale we're looking at here. There's also a measurement point, which is one of the points I really want to focus in on this talk. The chart on the right hand side just gives a little bit of historical context, and I've only looked at the last 15 years or so here. And what you can see here is just how this current episode compares with the financial crisis of 2008-9. Now, clearly these two episodes are not particularly comparable in understanding the causes and the consequences of the recessions, but what it does put into context is the scale. Now, I was around at the time of the financial crisis, and when we kind of saw a 6% or so fall, peak to trough fall in GDP, I thought that would be one of the largest I'd ever seen in my lifetime. Previously you'd have to go back to the Great Depression to kind of see similar scale. So really, in the case of the 100 years, that the financial crisis was in itself unparalleled. But then clearly what you can see in the latest, over the last 6 months or so, is just the scale of fall. And that was something that the panelists yesterday spoke about. Why is this recession different? It was very much not only the peak to trough fall, but also the bounce back in activity you're seeing there. And that will be the focus going forward. So that kind of sets the scene. And we kind of knew as an NSI that these were hundreds of numbers we'd likely be looking at. I mean, I don't want to put a specific number on it, but we were convinced we'd see at least a double-digit decline. And what we've seen in the UK is over a 20% fall in GDP in the first half of this year. So what I want to talk through is some of the main challenges that we faced in producing these estimates. And what I would just emphasize is there's a high levels of uncertainty around these estimates. These are far from final ones, and I think we'll continue to face these challenges going forward, both in terms of what's happened so far, but also that recovery path as and when some of these impacts may unwind. So the first challenge I want to speak about here is the measurement of non-market output. Now, this is one of the bits of the UK economy, or any economy, that's actually more challenging to record at the best of times. With market output, it's relatively straightforward. We look at the goods and services that are produced, and we have a market price to value those. Now, I don't want to play it that simple. There are, of course, challenges, particularly around the extent of quality adjustment in prices and the extent to which we can keep up with technological progress. But in terms of the framework, it's relatively straightforward in producing both current price estimates of market output, but also volume ones. This is less so with non-market output. And the real challenge we have here is the fact that there is no market price. There isn't a market mechanism to help us value those goods and services. So they're either provided free at the point of delivery, or they're prices that are not economically significant. So what we need to then consider is, well, how do we value non-market output? And there are typically two ways in which NSIs do this. And what I would say, and it's worth bearing in mind when you consider those international comparisons, is that there isn't a consensus. There is a best practice as to how to do this, but in terms of what NSIs implement, there is varying extents to which this is done. And it's not only across countries, but even within countries. With the UK, for example, we use a mix to kind of try to measure this. Now, the two approaches that are typically used are one that's referred to as a sum cost. So what this says is, well, we can't value the output that's produced, but what we can value is essentially the inputs. So this is the cost of the factors of production in terms of the production process of this non-market output, but also the intermediate consumption. That is the goods and services that are used up in the production process. So what we're looking to measure there are the labor costs involved in producing that output, the depreciation of fixed assets. So this is the capital consumption. And then, of course, we've got the actual factors of production themselves. So that's the current price way of measuring non-market output. Now, in terms of the volume output, you can kind of go down two ways. You can try to come up with a deflated sum of cost approach, or what you can look to do is measure volume indicators directly. So this is where there can be a slight disconnect, as it were, between the current price and the volume estimates. And so what we look at here are cost-weighted activity indicators. So for example, in healthcare, what we will look at is the number of patients that are treated. And then we weight that by the actual cost, the unit cost of production of that, that health intervention. And then with education, what we look to do is measure the number of students that are being taught. And again, that's weighted by its cost. The challenge here for us is that works quite well, pretty well in traditional times or normal times, but one can imagine that this has been particularly challenging in the context of the coronavirus pandemic. And that not only reflects the pandemic itself and the impact that's had on healthcare, but the policy response, specifically in the UK, of school closures. So the first example I'm just going to go through is health. And hopefully this is just setting up the building blocks for the more challenging concept of education. So what we've had to look at for healthcare here is what has the impact really been on the NHS? And here it's actually been quite challenging in that you've almost got two competing forces. When the pandemic first broke in March or so, the focus in the UK was the extent to which the NHS, the National Health Service, could have the physical capacity to manage the increasing caseload. So what we saw there was a significant rise in the number of critical care cases, and this happens to be one of the more high cost care that's provided. And also there was an increase in patient cases elsewhere. So these two forces kind of push up on the volume of healthcare output. But to help manage the kind of capacity constraints that we were faced with in the UK, there was also reductions in activity elsewhere in the NHS. So for example, there was a suspension of dental activities, the cancellation and postponement of outpatient activities and elective procedures. So you've almost got these two competing forces. So it's not necessarily a straightforward case as to healthcare would just be increasing, decreasing. We had to kind of consider the composition of how healthcare activities would be impacted and then understand their relative cost weights. And there was also a practical challenge. And the practical challenge is the fact that in the face of this health crisis, the practicalities of care providers providing us with the administrative records to record this information, a lot of that was kind of the data collection that was suspended. So we're faced with not only a more challenging landscape, but also just in terms of our traditional data collection, that was more uncertain because we were not really receiving the same data feeds in the same time frame that we were previously. And so that required leaning much more on kind of nowcast. And of course, as you can imagine, nowcast, there's a level of uncertainty at the best of times, but clearly we were not in those times. So what the chart here shows, if you just focus on the yellowish, brownish bars, that's the impact we've seen so far in the UK national accounts in terms of how we record health output. And I should say, I believe this excludes social care. So I've only looked at kind of healthcare in this example. So that was how we considered health. But the more challenging one, and it comes to one of the questions that I raised a little bit earlier, was the treatment of school closures. So one of the policy responses in the UK was to contain the spread of the virus. School closures came into effect in the UK in mid to late March or so, and this was nationwide. And so what we do in the UK is measure, in terms of the volume estimates of education output, is look at the number of full-time equivalent students in various educational settings. So there's 8 or so, and what this essentially captures is the full range of education that's provided. So if you think about primary schools and secondary schools, and it takes into account then the relative cost of those. So the challenge we had here is that, again, in normal times, this is relatively straightforward. There's not particularly that much variation for a given cohort in a year. Education is mandatory between the ages of 5 and 16. So if you take a given year, the number of students is not really going to change that much, simply because within a given year, that cohort of 5-year-olds or 6-year-olds or 7-year-olds, they will all be in education. And so while there may be changing between schools, there's not really going to be a change in terms of how many are being taught. So we collect essentially census information on the number of students that are enrolled in schools. However, in the context of school closures, that surely had an impact in terms of the education output that was being produced. And this is where the interesting dynamic applies in terms of whether you use a sum of costs or whether you look at volume indicators. So as I explained, in the UK, what we looked at was volume indicators. But what this can lead to is quite a bit of a tension between both your current price and your volume estimates. Alternatively, if you look at your implied deflators, which is essentially the implied price of providing that, there's going to be a large spike, because what we saw was, in terms of sum of costs, teachers were still being paid. There was still the compensation of employees that they were receiving. But actually there was a very large impact on how much education was being provided itself. So what we looked to do was try to capture what we thought was the volume effect on that education output. And there was really two factors there that we really wanted to consider. So one was the fact that, and I'll just make up some numbers here. Let's just say pre-coronavirus, the total number is 100 students. Now, clearly in school. Now, as the crisis hit, that number was greatly reduced. Schools were still open for the children of key workers and those who were considered vulnerable. So there was still some school provision, but that was much lower. So let's just say, for example, we go from 100 to 5. And that could be an estimate of the fall in education output. The problem with that is we've considered that to be an overestimate of the impact on education output provided, because what we moved to was a world of remote learning. So this is where, even though it wasn't physically taking place in school, teachers were still providing material for education to be taught remotely. So this could be through exercise and teaching material, lecture slides and notes, and that could be delivered very much like how we're delivering this conference. Alternatively, it could just be done in the home. But the idea was we wanted to estimate the fact that we still felt school provision was, education provision was still taking place, just in a remote environment. And one way you can kind of consider it is, to what extent is that a full-time equivalent? So at one end of the extreme, we could say they are perfect substitutes. It's irrespective of whether you're at school or at home. It's essentially, there is no difference. And in that effect, what you go back from is to that 5 I kind of spoke about, back up to 100. Alternatively, you could say these were not substitutes whatsoever. And actually there was just no education being taught remotely. And then in that instance, you've kind of got 0 full-time equivalents. And so you're back at 5. And we felt what the answer was somewhere in between. So what we wanted to do was actually, how do we capture this concept of remote learning? And what we did was actually, and again, it kind of reflects the fact that we're in 2020, but we were able to survey teachers through an app, a mobile phone app. And what we were asking there was the change in the amount of teacher input that had been applied. So we were asking teachers, in a typical week, how many hours do you provide teaching? And what have you done kind of post-pandemic? And that was the basis of an adjustment that we made to say, well, actually, we felt that some remote learning was taking place. And so we wanted to capture the fall in activity in school settings, but we wanted to capture then this remote instruction. The second challenge though we had was with that is the system of national accounts is very clear that home teaching sits outside of the production boundary. So there's a distinction between what is remote learning, which is a teacher providing education in a similar setting to how I'm delivering this talk, to that only being enabled by parents or guardians. And that should, because that sits outside of the production boundary, that doesn't sit inside GDP. And so what we wanted to kind of get a feel of is, well, how much of that education was being really enabled by parents? And I'm sure there are individuals on the line now who can kind of relate to this experience of having to kind of sit down and help their children through that. And again, through this app, what we were able to survey was to kind of get a feel of how much of that was being enabled by parents and guardians. And again, what we've done is then make a downward adjustment, because that should not be included in GDP. But what you can see here is the challenge as to whether you use a sum of costs or a current price type approach to measuring non-market output, or if you use a volume-based indicator. if you go down the sum of costs, you'll get a much smaller hit to education output. But if you try to adjust your volume indicator, you might get a much larger fall. And it's worth bearing that in mind when we look at those international comparisons. I can't control for all of those effects, but in terms of why the UK has experienced the largest fall in the first half of this year relative to other G7 countries, this is potentially one of the measurement challenges that might explain that. So the other main challenge, conceptual challenge we faced was a theoretical one along the job retention schemes. In terms of the UK's fiscal policy response, this was the largest feature in terms of the fiscal cost itself. And a phrase that will be very common amongst UK colleagues on the line, but also international ones, is this concept of furloughed workers. So essentially, what we introduced was to try to mitigate the effect of labour market scarring and a kind of disconnect from and a mass peak in unemployment and a disconnect from the labour market itself. We introduced job retention schemes. So in terms of the labour market, what we've seen, and numbers were produced, I think it was earlier this week, is the unemployment rate itself so far hasn't nudged up too much. It's at 4.1%, so it's kind of ticked up a couple from 3.9, but the adjustment's very much been in hours worked, and that's both in total and average hours. So these individuals continue to remain as employed, so they're economically active, and they maintain the working relationship with their employer, but they are essentially at home and they are no longer working. So in the labour market, that was quite relatively straightforward in terms of conceptually where they would be. The debate was whether furloughed workers should be essentially economically active or not. But in the National Council, there was some other challenges we had to consider, and it was essentially to do with the payments here. So what we had were two schemes. These were the coronavirus job retention schemes and the self-employment income support scheme. And these two are very similar in their design. It's just that one is aimed for employees and one is aimed for self-employed. Now, the policy itself has changed a little bit over the last 6 months and will be unwound at the end of October. I'm only going to talk through the first phase because that's all you need to know in terms of the principles. But you could tweak it in line with how the policy has evolved over the last 6 months. But in essence, the aim of the coronavirus job retention scheme is to retain their employees. And so employers were able to apply for a grant that covered 80% of their usual monthly wagely cost. And this is capped at £2,500 per month. So what this was saying was, instead of making your worker unemployed in the face of the shock, keep them on your books, keep them as employed, but what it is, the government will pick up 80% of their wages and salaries. And so the idea was the businesses would receive a subsidy payment in that, but they would receive the financial support to help keep that employee on the book. So if you think about the mechanisms here, there's clearly a fiscal cost to the government, and that's equivalent to this 80% furlough payment. In terms of the business, they're able to keep the employee on their books. So, and the idea would be as we unwind from the kind of lockdown or the extreme lockdown and activity recovers, there will be, those employers would be able to bring back to work those furloughed employees. And the key bit I really want to get across here is what was the motivation? And it was to help allow a quick return to production once it was physically able to do so. So once we moved away from lockdown and activity returned, the focus was by keeping those employees on their books, it would allow production to return quickly. And this is why this is treated as an other subsidy on production. And so the chart here shows, I believe it's the Q2 for nominal GDP, and it's looking at the income estimates. And what you can see here is compensation employees, while it has fallen, the effect has been relatively muted, given what one might have expected or what we would have seen had there not been this job retention scheme. But where you can see the fiscal cost is in the taxes less subsidies. So this is a subsidy from government to the business, and the business continues paying their employee. Now, in the first version of the job retention scheme, that furloughed employee was not able to work. So you can kind of think about this as a balanced concept in GDP. The output of that employee was zero, but also the income was zero. It was, what we were seeing was just pure offsets within income. They were still receiving a compensation. They were still being scored as wages and salaries, but we had an exact offset through the other subsidy and production. So again, the income is zero in terms of net, and this is why you can think of it as a balanced concept in GDP. What we've also seen in the UK is that some employers have been willing to pay top-ups, and again, that's well within the right, but where we would see that is the impact of gross operating surpluses instead of taxes and less subsidies. So I just very quickly want to go through some of the practical challenges we face. This is a little bit faint, so apologies for that. But what I'm showing here is the revisions profile of UK GDP over a 50-year period. And what you can see, so it's very faint there, but the blue lines are showing the revision between the first estimate and the one published 3 years later. And the highlighted areas are kind of the 4 recessionary periods we've seen over that period. So the 2 takeaways there are, while the mean revision has kind of fallen over time, so there's been a structural improvement in how we record GDP, there is a tendency for those revisions to be larger around turning points. And that was the real fear that we had going into this episode. And what we really want to do was kind of build on the lessons learned from the 2008 financial crisis. I'll just quickly go through some of the challenges we faced. Imputations was the main one. In producing timely estimates of GDP, it's inevitable that you'll need to impute for missing values, and that's based on those non-responses. Now, we can impute for those values, but the challenge we have is whether those non-responses share the similar characteristics as respondents. And there was reasons to believe that wouldn't be the case. But what we did here was kind of look into non-respondents, particularly the new ones. So we kind of got their historic performance. And what we did was actually do telephone and email interviews to kind of better understand whether those businesses were still trading or not, and how they've been impacted. And we could reflect that in how we imputed for those values. We also did some desk research just to kind of see whether those businesses were still trading. And in the UK, what we've established is a fortnightly survey, the Business Impact of Coronavirus Survey. And again, that was a scope to help pick up possible non-respondents. I'll quickly go through these 2 and then conclude. In the UK, we apply single extrapolation to produce estimates of GDP. So I'm only focusing on the most recent quarters here. But what we essentially say here is output is a proxy for value added. The challenge with this is that it requires us to rely on the assumption that output and intermediate consumption are moved broadly in line with one another. And while that might hold in normal times, that's less likely to be in turning points, but more so in this one. There are probably examples of businesses, but even industries that have produced zero output, but are still incurring ongoing costs such as rental payments or energy costs. And so that disconnect between output and intermediate consumption probably undermines this assumption of single extrapolation. So this is a concern, and deflation is one. There have been talks at this conference around the impact on expenditure shares, if you think about how consumer prices are collected. Similarly with business prices, if you think about the practical challenge in recording this, but also the change in behaviors. So businesses may be producing more of a certain type of output in response to the pandemic. So what we ideally would be able to capture is up-to-date product weights, but that's really difficult to do in real time. So it's quite likely that the deflators that we have, both on producer prices, but also consumer prices, are not really reflecting the reality that we face today. So I'm going to just finish now with this final slide, which is just with the conclusions, really to kind of say why this episode was different, but how the framework allowed us to kind of identify both the theoretical challenges we knew we would face, but also some of the lessons learned from the financial crisis, also adapted to face the current climate as some of the practical ones. This is not specific to the UK. Every NSI in the world is facing similar challenges, and I'm sure you've heard about those over the last day or so. This is going to be reflecting high levels of uncertainty, but a key aspect of our response has been the transparency in which we've looked to communicate with a wide range of users. So this is not only our traditional policymakers and forecasters in the UK, but also the media, and also at conferences, but trying to engage a lot more with the wider public. And I think a key response will be collaboration with other NSIs. So that's all I wanted to cover. Thank you so much for your time, and I'm very happy to kind of pick up any questions that you may have.
Sumit, I actually have a question of my own, if that's okay, whilst others might be typing them into the box. But I was really curious about what you were talking about how kind of homeschooling and parents helping with that kind of obviously falls outside of the production boundary in the national accounts. And I imagine many parents would say, actually, I worked really hard to educate my child, and possibly have similar things with people picking up informal care as kind of care packages were changed or cancelled during the pandemic. And also we can't rip up the manuals, but I wondered if this provides sort of more motivation going forward to kind of focus on unpaid work and how that contributes to the economy.
Excellent question, and I think the short answer is yes. So what we have, and I think this is the case for other NSIs as well, is household satellite accounts. So very much a focus on home production. I think the crisis has probably highlighted just how important this is. It was always known that there's been a big debate as to whether GDP is particularly a good indicator of welfare, and I think it's well established that that's not the case, but it was not the purpose of GDP. But we would always find maybe somewhat trivial examples, maybe, is how others can perceive it. But I think, as you say, the importance of kind of home production is being much more paramount, because I think more households are now actually understanding what this means. So when you think about examples like, typically it might be things like housework or cooking, I think people kind of dismiss this a little bit, but I think this is a really good example where clearly there's a value added to the teaching of our children, but it's just not recorded in GDP. So I think it kind of really reinforces not only the whole welfare debate, but probably the importance of actually developing household satellite accounts, and just really picking up this activity. So I fully agree. And I think there's also then a point around helping facilitate international comparisons as well. Each country's gone through their own experiences, but I think the more information that we collect on things like food, maybe time use surveys, for example, I think the more understanding we have. And it also, I think, shows a bit more light in terms of how many of these kind of COVID shocks will remain, I suppose, in terms of structural shifts in the economy. So yes, it's a very short answer, and I gave a little bit more for long-winded one.
We do actually have a question now in the Q&A box from Joseph Haynes. So hopefully you'll be able to unmute yourself in a second and ask that, Joseph.
Yeah, hi. So to begin with, I think ONS deserve huge praise for their work on non-market output during COVID. They've done this better than any other NSI, but the downside of that is that ONS has contributed hugely to the death of international comparable GDP in the last 6 months, because countries are no longer measuring headline GDP in the same way because of the different treatment of non-market output. So my question relates to how can that be resolved? Is Eurostat going to have to make a ruling that everyone needs to follow the ONS way of doing it, or are they going to say no, everyone just needs to follow a more simple volume measure way of doing it in order to maintain international comparability?
So I think that's an excellent question, and it's one I'm kind of looking at right now. I can't really comment on necessarily what Eurostat or may or may not do, but I think it's one of those, it was one of the very final points on my slide, which was kind of facilitating the collaboration and the kind of engagement with partner countries. I think what it is with non-market output, and I didn't really appreciate it. So in the UK, it was in 2005, the Atkinson Review was published, and it's very much focused on how we record non-market output in the UK. And so we've made quite a lot of progress in that. What I hadn't realised is where other countries kind of sit on that spectrum, and it is really difficult. But as you say, it can make international comparisons quite challenging, particularly as I have found it really difficult to understand what other NSIs do, and I'm sure they not, before 6 months ago, they didn't quite understand what the UK did. So I think the answer is very much kind of conversations take place at the international level through bodies such as you say, Eurostat, OECD, and then kind of bring together around the table. It's one of those bits in the national accounts where you've got, it's considered best practice, but it's not prescribed as far as I understand what countries should do. And I think that really just reflects it is really difficult. So I'm hoping in terms of how it's resolved, I don't think it's necessarily a short-term answer, but whether it's one which can be resolved in a few years' time as we kind of help countries move in the same direction and kind of move towards volume indicators, if that's considered best practice. I think that's probably the way forward. I appreciate that's looking quite a long way down the line and not particularly useful right now. Whether there's the scope to look at almost experimental estimates to kind of try to improve the comparability, so it wouldn't necessarily help you with like the official GDP numbers, but I think it would help users get a better understanding of the conceptual challenges, but also the practical ones. So that's kind of the conversations I would like to take place. That's probably how I would look to do it. But I think there's probably other viewpoints as well. So I don't necessarily prescribe that as the way forward, but that would be my response. But thank you for the question.
There doesn't seem to be any more questions, and I think we are out of time. So, Sumit, I don't know if you want to just wrap up there.
No, well, look, thank you to all the speakers and all the questions received. I thought that was a really interesting set of debates that we had there, and it kind of showed some of the challenges that both in the UK and Japan were facing, some of the statistical challenges, and it was quite wide-ranging there. So I just want to thank all the participants, but particularly speakers for their time and for some excellent presentations. And I hope you all enjoy the rest of the conferences, and including your lunch breaks right now. So look, thank you so much. Take care, everyone.